Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ramel Mustafa, Professor and Director of the Lawrence National Center here at Ivey Business School. On behalf of the Center and the Ivey Alumni Network Ottawa chapter, I'd like to welcome you to today's live webinar titled, Not Gonna Miss Our Shot, Vaccines, Resilience, and Economic Competitiveness. A special thanks to our teams at Ivey Events and the Ivey Academy who have been integral in supporting this event. Today's discussion is part of an ongoing series of dialogues the Center has hosted covering important policy conversations that are critical to recovery, building resilience, and unlocking Canada's competitive advantage for our nation's future prosperity. Our conversation today will examine the current status of Canada's health crisis and vaccine rollout, discuss strategies for reopening main streets and reviving the hardest hit industries, and explore whether and how Canada can build resiliency and competitive advantage around domestic vaccine supply. Needless to say, the pandemic has spotlight on the vulnerabilities in our health and social infrastructure, which is inextricably linked to our socioeconomic development. Joining us this afternoon is an esteemed group of panelists who will offer us a unique perspective on today's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Bernstein, President and CEO of CIFAR, member of Canada's COVID-19 Vaccine Task Force, and chair of the Variants of Concern Scientific Advisory Council. Alan is one of Canada's leading scientists, having authored over 225 scientific publications and has made landmark contributions to Canada's medical research ecosystem. Welcome, Alan. Also with us is Karima Essabar, CEO of Pork Venture and chair of the federal government's Health and Biosciences Economic Strategy Table. Karima has had a successful career spanning global pharmaceutical and biotechnology firms, startups, not-for-profit organizations, and venture investment firms. Thank you, Karima, for joining us today. We are very fortunate to also have with us Goldie Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada, an organization representing the chief executives and heads of leading Canadian businesses. Goldie currently also serves as the co-chair of Canada's World Trade Organization Business Advisory Council. A warm welcome to you, Goldie. Steering the conversation today is Lawrence National Center Fellow Paul Wells. Paul is a senior writer at Maclean's Magazine, an award-winning author, has covered 8 Canadian federal elections, 4 prime ministers, and is an alumnus of Western University. Paul, thank you for joining us and moderating this discussion. For our attendees, please note that a link to the recording of this webinar will be sent to all registrants by the end of this week by email. And thank you for submitting your questions in advance. They have been incorporated into our discussion today. We do have a lot to cover, so Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ramel, and thanks to our distinguished panel for joining us today. And thanks to everyone at home. I'm Paul Wells. It's true, I have covered 8 federal elections, maybe very soon a 9th. In case you're wondering, yes, it's absolutely true that we stole the title for this panel, Not Gonna Miss Our Shot, from the Broadway musical Hamilton. A good play on words never goes amiss. We're going to briefly go over the events of the last few months and ask how vaccine distribution has gone so far. We're going to survey what needs to happen and or what risks happening over the next few months as we enter what everyone devoutly hopes is the final phase of this pandemic. And then we're essentially going to ask, and we're going to take the bulk of our time to discuss how do we get ready for our next time, or how do we integrate vaccine production capacity, vaccine distribution capacity into a broader framework of economic competitiveness and resilience for Canada over the next several years. And so let's start that with the first component, which is the recent past, the sort of story to date. I'm going to ask Dr. Bernstein, Alan Bernstein, how do you think Canada's vaccine distribution has been going so far? Has it been a success? And where do you think governments deserve credit or blame?
So I want to go back, Paul, before that actually, because the distribution of what. So I think we have to, first of all, acknowledge that we're in unprecedented waters here. No government, no country has ever gone through this sort of crisis before. Indeed, the planet has never gone through a crisis that has involved so many people at the same time as this one. So so I think we have to cut ourselves some slack in terms of have we made mistakes? Yep. Should we learn from them? Absolutely. But these are new territories. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say is, back in the spring of, well, a year ago now, the federal government created a vaccine task force, which I've had the honor to sit on since then. And we worked really, our task was to do two things. One was to recommend to the ministers which vaccines Canada should enter into agreements with. And secondly, to deal with our vaccine manufacturing issues, because Cabinet, I think, recognized before we were created that there were issues around vaccine manufacturing. So I think the first thing Canada did really well, and I'm now sort of promoting the vaccine task force here, but that's fine, is we recommended exactly the right vaccines. So we recommended Pfizer, we recommended Moderna, we recommended the viral vectors, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, and we recommended Novavax and Sanofi Pasteur, and we recommended Medicago, Quebec-based company. Now, the interesting thing about those recommendations, we all have the advantage of hindsight now. We're all sort of, Pfizer is becoming the vaccine of the planet. Over 1.2 billion doses of Pfizer have been given out so far. Is back then, when we went through the whole portfolio, and we decided we would take a portfolio approach because we didn't know what would work. The RNA vaccine were viewed as being long shots. That was a whole new technology. The real tried and true were the protein subunits, Novavax and Sanofi Pasteur. They have yet to make it to market. The second ones we depended on were the viral vectors. Well, there's some issues with the AstraZeneca and with the Johnson & Johnson. So there's been a complete turnaround of which ones worked, and that's the nature of science. And so we thought we did a pretty good job in recommending a portfolio of exactly the right vaccines. The third thing I would say about that is, I don't think very many Canadians know this, but they should, that Canadian science has played a major role in the development of the RNA vaccines and the viral vector vaccines. All the RNA vaccines are wrapped in a bubble, a lipid, so-called lipid nanoparticle. Without that, we would not have RNA vaccines. Those little soap bubbles, as I call them, or lipid nanoparticles, were developed at UBC in Vancouver by Peter Collis's lab 30 years ago. So it's one of those issues of fundamental science that you don't know where it's going to end up. And so all of Pfizer's vaccines are wrapped in bubbles made by companies that Peter Collis founded in Vancouver. That's a really important statement to make. Secondly, the viral vector vaccines, their origin all started, the one in Oxford, the one in Johnson & Johnson, all started at McMaster University by Frank Graham, who's now retired in Rome. But Frank developed adenovirus as a vector of choice for delivering genes into cells. So that's been a fundamental sort of platform for vaccine technology. So Canadian science has played a huge role. I think the third thing I would say to address your question is when we being the cabinet now, not the vaccine task force, when Minister Anand and others in cabinet started to negotiate with the vaccine production companies, we didn't have much to offer, actually. We didn't have a major manufacturing facility. We're not a large country, so we're not a large market. And so I think they had an uphill battle to get on the radar screen of the companies that we are now so dependent on. And I think, I'm not an apologist for the government, but I think they did a bloody good job, actually, in making sure after initial hiccups in January and February, that we are now getting more doses than we know how to distribute. Indeed, per capita, we're vaccinating more people than any other country on the planet at the moment. So Canada is doing 400,000 a day in this country. And pretty soon we're going to catch up to the US and the UK in terms of single doses administered, and hopefully soon double doses, because you need double doses to get true protection. So I would say, I would give us a A- or a B+ in terms of how we've done. But I think it does speak to where we're going to come to. It's the need to have some bargaining chips next time around.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me ask Goldie Hyder to chip in next, because Goldie, I mean, the Business Council thinks about the economy as a whole and the needs of Canadian business as a whole, but the Business Council also took an early interest in this specific question of being ready for vaccines and has played a strong advocacy role. How do you think we've done so far?
Well, it might surprise you and the listeners that I'm going to begin by complimenting the government on its vaccine procurement strategy, given how much has been said about the vaccine procurement strategy over the last 6 months or so. I mean, as Alan rightly said, and we're so grateful to have people like Alan and others giving the advice to the government to say, listen, when you are not a manufacturing country of vaccines, you are not going to lead the world out of the gate on vaccine execution, right? That's why the Americans and the British had the head start in India, for that matter. So we kind of knew that we weren't going to be winning the race out of the gate. But, you know, just like the Montreal Canadiens, what matters is not how you start, it's how you finish. And how we're going to finish is probably at the top of the world when it comes to being vaccinated at pretty high numbers, because Canadians do what they're told for the most part. And I think it's really important that every one of us continue to stress to Canadians that getting vaccinated is the most important thing you can do. Fully vaccinated, not halfway, fully. It's the best way to manage the variants. It's the best way to get your life back. It's the best way to restart our economy. It's the best way for us to be together again as human beings. So let's make sure we take advantage of that. I think we're going to do extremely well because of the diversity of the portfolio and because of the volume that was purchased. So we should all rest easy. I realize media headlines, you know, and political headlines carry the day on these things, but the Canadian public should be reassured. We're going to be okay. We're going to be just fine. In fact, in a matter of less than 6 weeks, we will surpass the US on their second doses because they've stalled while we're going to continue to accelerate. So I think we've been very fortunate for not being a manufacturing country. That is an important recognition. Now, I would also say, though, that the Canadian resiliency story is an important one here as well. As Alan says, you know, none of us have been through this in our lifetime. Obviously, we weren't there when the Spanish flu killed 50 million people. So I'm not sure we've not seen this before. We have. It's different now, but we've seen it. And what we've seen is a resiliency on the mind of Canadian citizens and Canadian businesses, if I can say. Many have compared this pandemic to, you know, a wartime response, if you will. And just like happened in the world wars, Canadians stepped up, doing what they were told, you know, being compliant, trying to keep up with the bouncing ball, sometimes often confusing messages. God bless them, our public health officials. They're no different than many others. There's different points of view amongst the experts, but somehow Canadians had to filter through all of that. And I want to applaud their resilience. Obviously, our essential workers, you know, and our healthline workers and so forth. But if I can say, Canadian businesses also stepped up to that call. And I think we learned that when government and business work together, you can solve problems. You can solve problems for society because we weren't able to manufacture before some of the things that were critical. Yet companies that made aerospace products or companies that made auto parts pivoted to make ventilators. You know, something that they had to learn to do very quickly, and we had the capacity, the innovation, and the ability to do it. Companies like Canada Goose, who were making, you know, very popular winter garb and others around the world, pivoted to started making attire for nurses and doctors and frontline workers. That could go on and on and on. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that that partnership is a lesson that we need to take away between business and government, academia and others, of course, to work together. If I can just say, though, on the downside, because I think this is very important, my staff have heard me say regularly that if you want to honor the lives of those that we've lost, make life better for those that have lived. And part of the way of doing that is to make sure we do something we didn't do after SARS, which is we gathered the data and the information and it went away somewhere. We didn't act on it. So we owe it to those lives that have been lost, Paul and colleagues on the panel, to make sure that we do that audit, that postmortem, and have those learnings, not just on a shelf somewhere, but implemented so that we can prepare better for the next one. And let's be clear, the next one may not need ventilators. It may not be a respiratory. We don't know. But we have to make sure that we as Canadians are positioned from a supply chain perspective and beyond. The other area that I think we all need to look at as Canadians, and this won't surprise a veteran like you, Paul, is the functioning of the Federation. It has left, for me personally, a lot to be desired. Sometimes I thought the European Union did a better job working as a union than we did working as a country, federal, provincial, municipal. It's caused great confusion amongst Canadians. We often hear about the three, there are three layers of government. Well, there's only one layer of Canadian. And those Canadians were looking for clear, consistent communications on masks, on the borders, on social distancing, on compliance, and they didn't get it. Despite that, Canadians have filtered through all of that noise, about the vaccine delays, about the gap between the vaccines, and they've said, you know what, I've concluded that vaccines are the best things for me. So I applaud Canadians for seeing through all of that noise and that cloud and sometimes contradictory advice and making their own best judgment. But ultimately, this is a story of healthcare. This crisis is a health crisis that triggered an economic crisis. But we need to retrospectively, and again, I don't think our political parties have spent a lot of time talking about healthcare in the last 20 years. But we need to ask ourselves, how is it that after all of this, we weren't very good at rolling out testing, tracking, and tracing as successful ways to mitigate the spread of the virus? And secondly, this is a virus that basically exposes our ICU beds. We're only locking up because ICU beds can't sustain the pressure that's coming their way. Where's all that money going? Where's all that accelerator funding for healthcare going? We need to do a really good job of looking back, Paul, so that we don't make the same mistakes as we go forward.
Okay, thanks very much, Goldie, for that really thorough 30,000-foot survey of the terrain. And now, Karima Sabar, through your work on the Health and Biosciences and Economic Strategy table, you had looked more thoroughly into the current state of Canada's health sciences capability than a lot of people. Given what you had given that work that you'd already done before the pandemic started, how do you evaluate our performance on vaccines since the trouble began?
Thank you so much, Paul. I think Alan and Goldie pretty much covered the background and the status of where we are today. What I would just add to and not repeat is, I thought that there were some things that government really did exceptionally, and I'll come back to smacking them on the knuckles in a moment. But what they really did well was, for example, Health Canada, stepped up and really became very agile and kind of expedited the approvals and the whole regulatory front of reviewing data on an ongoing basis, as opposed to kind of collecting everything and doing it 18 months from now. And this is a lesson that I'm sure they've learned that we can look at on an ongoing basis, because one of the criticisms we have, and in our review at the economic strategy tables, was around regulation and the lack of agility and the multiple layers that Goldie referred to, the federal, provincial, territorial approach to everything that we need to do. Whereas here we could bypass all that, and within a matter of weeks we're able to respond. So there are some phenomenal lessons that can be learned, and we must ensure that these are lessons that are put into practice and are systematized and not forgotten. Similarly, to Alan's point around multi-vaccine procurement approach, that was brilliant. I mean, Canada was kind of a leader in the world in looking at interacting with multiple suppliers right up front out of the gate, and ensuring that we were going to look at this in a multi-supply kind of an approach. Many countries didn't do that and suffered as a result of that, many of the European countries. But what I want to say is, one of the things that we tend to do as Canadians is we do get stuck in process, and halfway through things, partly because of the fragmentation of our system with this federal, provincial, territorial, it serves us well in certain instances, but not in healthcare delivery, I would say. That we got stuck in process, and really there was a lot of anxiety amongst the population. Certain provinces were extremely anxious, who had less support, the smaller provinces and so forth. And everything was sort of out of sync there for a while, which could have been avoided if there was a national response and a national implementation. And it is something that we're going to have to look at. Another big lesson, and I want you to chop those lessons that as we go along, that we need to learn is this national approach. We're a big country with a small population. We're too fragmented. We don't have the luxury of doing the, my region thing. We need to really mobilize on a national level. And there's so many things we can do at one time. 50 years ago, when our healthcare system was established, we were one of the best in the world. Everybody looked at us and modeled themselves to us, but we have not modernized and we have not updated that system. And nobody wants to ever take a bite out of that elephant's leg, but we're going to have to sooner or later. And I hope that this pandemic is going to get us there. This was a discussion we had at our economic strategy tables as well. So some of the big things that we said is, look, bold ambitions need more than just good intentions. There's big things that we have to do. I'll list just 5 things that had come out of our tables, which had we implemented some of these things early, and we started to, in fairness to government, we've just begun and then COVID hit us. So when we got this report out in 2018, October, we said a health policy environment that sees the healthcare of Canadians and economic growth of the health and bioscience sector as mutually reinforcing. In other words, there's got to be a joint mandate for economic development and health. These are not separated. It's a national, and you will come to that, and I'm sure you'll grill me on it, but we think it's a national priority for the country. And there is an opportunity to build on our strengths and turn, what we see as a cost all the time in health into an economic output. So we can talk about that later if we want. We talked about public healthcare system that is an early adopter and has to be incentivized to support innovation adoption. We are a great innovating country because we have a fantastic ecosystem of wonderful universities, research institutes, entrepreneurs. We know how to do startups. We know how to do all of that, but we're not a great adopter of innovation. So we cannot call ourselves an innovative nation when we are not ready to adopt our own innovations early on. The agile and streamlined regulatory process, I talked about that, and I think that's where some things have happened that I've been really pleasantly surprised, where government has really stepped up early. We need a national, robust, digitalized, interconnected, patient-centered, data infrastructure. These were some of the things, that had we had in place, think of where we would have been if we had been fully digitized. And then a large, vibrant life science capital market and all of those things. But I'll leave it there for us to move on to the next sections around economic development.
Well, and I do think the bulk of our conversation is going to deal with these sort of structural things that we can get in place for the future. I was going to ask what happens next, but we all know what happens next. More people get more vaccines, and then we all get to go out back into concert halls in September. Let me unpack two of the assertions that came out of this conversation that just happened. One was Karima talked about a sort of regulatory sluggishness, and my question for the group is, now that the government has awakened from that regulatory sluggishness, and I think everyone agrees, really moved fast and effectively in recent months. Does it go back to sleep once the crisis is over, or is this a permanent Ebenezer Scrooge-like transformation at the end of the story? I mean, or like, once the crisis is over, does the effectiveness go away again too? Let's start with you, Goldie.
Well, I'm smirking here a bit because some of my members who have interacted with the government have said, look, full marks, government did move quickly. Government did respond reasonably quickly, and we weren't prepared to the way we needed to be, but we knew what we had to do. And their view is that they sure hope that this muscle that has been developed it remains exercised, that it does not go back into its resting phase, if you will, because what it shows is that when there is the need, governments can move. And I think one of the things coming out of the pandemic that's reassuring for citizens is when you really need your government, it's proven that it can work for you, whether it's on the vaccine front, whether it's on the the support for businesses or support for individuals for work, whatever the case might be. From a business perspective, what we're saying is, can we keep that up because what we can't do is going back to we return you now to regularly scheduled programming, and we're back to where we were, you know, in 2019, because first of all, the world we're going back to is a very different world than the world we left behind last February. Countries have developed these muscles. Countries have become much more aggressive. They become much more deliberate, much more intentional in what they're trying to do. I want to give a shout out to Chancellor Rishi Sunak over in the United Kingdom that put together a plan for growth in partnership with business, very focused on competitiveness about a country that just walked away from a trade deal in terms of a union in the European Union, wants to compete on its own. There's a desperation there. There's an urgency there. There's a recognition there that if shape or be shaped, live or die, like we've got to fight. The challenge of being Canadian is we have been blessed and cursed by geography. Now, the geography isn't going to change, but the attitude needs to change. The idea that whether it was the British who took care of us for 75 years or the Americans who took care of us for 75 years in terms of having our back, nobody has our back anymore. We need to fight and assert for our own responsibilities and our own rights and our own ability to take care of our citizens. That does not mean I'm advocating for nationalism or territorialism or parochialism or anti-trade. On the contrary, we live or die by trade, by foreign investment, by immigration. You take away any of those things from the Canadian, you know, economic stool, it not only wobbles, it falls down. So we've got to use this moment to not only get governments to see this, Paul, but with all due respect, we've got to make sure that the public understands, that citizens understand that you shouldn't penalize governments for trying to think a little long-term or to try and do things that make us more competitive. We've got to make sure we educate Canadians in that regard. Otherwise, we're going to go right back to business as usual on the political front.
Alan Bernstein, parts of your remark reminded me of conversations that you and I have had for more than 20 years about governments thinking they can pick winners when in fact the world is full of surprises, and the need to develop a sort of a robust science capacity across disciplines so that surprising events can have swift response. Do you think governments, plural, have learned lasting lessons from this crisis?
Well, I think the discussion we just had on regulation is an example, I think, and also the rollout as rapidly as it was of personal support for business was a demonstration to government, never mind to citizens, that government can act quickly. I think that was a really important learning exercise for our civil servants and for leadership in government. It was amazing to me to watch how quickly the CERB rolled out, for example, for help for individual citizens. Remarkable. And that's with the civil service working from home. So we had a double transformation. We had 50,000 civil servants all of a sudden working from home, and secondly, all of a sudden sending out billions of dollars worth of checks within minutes to Canadians. Ditto the Health Canada regulatory thing. So I think governments have learned something. Somebody used earlier the metaphor of peacetime and wartime here. In wartime you do things differently. There's an urgency in war that is not there in peacetime. And so I think what Karima and Goldie are both saying, and I would agree with it, is how do we maintain that urgency when hopefully we revert back to peacetime? How do we maintain that, not just in government, but throughout societies, in business and academia and research, in startups, our venture capitalists? How do we have that hunger that is so critical in a world that, to paraphrase Goldie, that's going to be changed so profoundly as a result of this pandemic? So I think government probably feels pretty good about what they've done, and I think they should. Now, again, my opening remarks were, did they do everything perfectly? No, and there are a lot of lessons. Maybe we'll come to them, but I'll just say one thing here, which we've not touched on. One of the things that really needs working on, and we touched on it in terms of healthcare, actually, in terms of the provinces, is what I call smooth transitions. The transmission between, for example, and this is an area, a world that I know best, between our public health officials and public health agencies and our research organizations and our researchers, because that coupling has been key, especially when the variants first started to appear. How do we take advantage of our robust research environment that we've been applauding, and feed that into public health and make sure public health can act quickly, and vice versa. How does the research community find out about a new variant as quickly as possible so they can work with their colleagues in public health? So that transmission across sectors, not just between provinces, but between business and academia, between public health and research, I think needs some work. And it's very hard, I think, to put together those relationships in the middle of a war. Ideally, those relationships are structured in peacetime and can be activated during war.
Interestingly, I think clearly we're getting a sense that there were quite a bit of action from the government, as well as a lot of kudos goes there. And at the same time, thinking about this, that one of the key messages that is coming out from this discussion is that we'll have to keep the momentum going in ways that really takes ideas to action. So I want to push the conversation a little to that end, thinking more about as we open up our economy down the road, there are discussions about vaccine passports and other ways to in a way to create somewhat normal the new normal, if you will. Karima, if I may get to you, thinking about that process, and there's quite a bit of perhaps things that we have to do in order to get our normal life back, if you will, if I may use that term. And I don't know even how the normal life is going to look like, potentially maybe somewhat different. And then maybe we'll take the discussion further into thinking about how do we build competitive advantage around vaccine production and et cetera.
So the first thing I would say is, look, the best way to get back to normal, whatever normal is going to be, and it is never going to be the normal that we left behind. We're going to move forward. It is to generate herd immunity and to have as many people immunized as possible in the world. And the thing that we have to think about is, of course, first we have to get Canadians all immunized. And I think we still have some hesitancy amongst some groups, and there needs to be that aggressive education and enabling so that all Canadians can have their 2 shots to start with. And we don't know if it ends at 2 shots. I'm sure Alan can speak more to that, whether we'll need to have the boosters later, but right now that everybody gets immunized, and also that we enable other countries, especially the developing countries that are not going to be able to do this. I mean, today we heard the G7 approved, 1 billion doses. Well, 1 billion doses isn't going to make a big dent when we need 11 billion doses. And so we need a real commitment, from the developed world, and a generosity towards humanity, and access for this. So if Canada's got all these other vaccines coming, great, we can give some of them away to others. So world is too small. Until we have a global herd immunity and we have enough people immunized around the world, we'll never be safe, and we'll never be able to have that normality that we're seeking. That's number one. Number two is, I'm not a big fan of showing passports and things. I'm born in Africa. I came from Kenya. I know what happened in South Africa. People don't like to show, passports. But the reality is that we have an obligation to keep others safe. If we don't want to be vaccinated, we cannot impose our situations on others. And we have to keep other people safe. So, for the short term, or, until we have the world stabilized, I'm not averse certainly to having, vaccine passports or whatever, as long as we keep it simple, it's easy, and people are not, really targeted and alienated as a result of that. So we're going to have to do that for sure. But there are lots of other things, you know, in these learnings that we have, you know, the whole business of working from home and all of those kinds of things. It's changed forever. You know, I don't think people are going to accept going back to the norm as it was. And why should they? We want to do it better. So I think, you know, that's the direction that we would be moving in.
I want to follow up, Karima Escobar, because your roundtable was essentially an attempt to persuade the federal government that a robust pharmaceutical industry is key to a certain level of economic growth, or a key contributor to a certain level of economic growth. And it seemed a partial rebuttal to a sentiment that's abroad in the land that actually a pharmaceutical industry is simply elite, expensive, annoyingly global and independent of Canadian jurisdictions, can go somewhere else, and therefore you can't depend on them. So why bother? And I wonder whether, first of all, whether you accept the caricature that I'm providing of the landscape within which you are operating, and secondly, whether you think recent events make the case for Canada working in a more coordinated way to welcome and attract significant homegrown pharmaceutical capability.
So yes, I mean, I would say that there are some who think, as you have described, many, and I would say to them, rethink. We should, you know, as a country, you should be building to your strengths.
Yep.
We've already done the heavy lifting in the bioscience, life science sector. The heavy lifting is already done. What's the heavy lifting? If you look at the ecosystem, and if I could just describe it for a minute to you, it starts, the watering hole is world-class academic institutions and research institutions and leading scientists who then do the discovery and the innovation. That's the watering hole. If you don't have that, it's kind of difficult to get to anywhere else without that. Well, Canada has one of the best. We rank in the top universities in the world. The new rankings just came up, and our top 3 are once again in the top 3 and have moved up, and our top 15 are once again, you know, we have great institutions, we have great scientists. We are ranked, if you look at the top 1% of citations, and Alan will tell you that's how scientists are, you know, are recognized. Canada is always in the top 3 or 4 rankings of the top 1% of those citations. So we do great science, bottom line. We know how to do startups. We have wonderful entrepreneurs who've come from other sectors and as well, and then, you know, with startup companies. This is a low carbon footprint industry and sector. This is a high paying, it's not elitist, but it's a high paying sector and industry. Yes, it is easily transferable, but why should it be transferred if you have the right environment for the ecosystem to grow? So what's the second part of the ecosystem? It's being able to scale up companies. It's being able to anchor companies here and to realize the economic benefit of those companies and that technology in Canada. Where we've fallen short in Canada is in that latter part of scaling up sufficiently in biomanufacturing and enabling these companies to stay here, and in anchoring them. And that's partly to do with the capital and our policies and a bunch of things which are easily rectifiable. And our reports have, you know, endless recommendations around that of what needs to be done. It's about having a will to do it and to build on our strengths. Because what Canada has been in the past, you look at many innovations around the world, Paul, and you'll see they came from Canada, is that we've been an off-balance sheet pipeline of innovation and technology and an off-balance sheet pipeline of talent for the rest of the world. If we could close the loop on our ecosystem and really be committed to investing and building it on a scale and scope, and that's what we've been asking government to do, is we're not asking you to pick winners and losers in terms of which companies to invest in, but you've got to have an industrial policy around the sectors that you want to build on. What does Canada want to look like 10 years from now? And are you not going to, enable those sectors if you want to build an innovation-driven, digitized ESG economy? We better do that. So that's, I think, what we've been talking about. And we've been saying, look, if you look at any of the sectors, you look at, the vaccine business. Now, vaccine business, let me tell you about that. I have to get this off my chest, because we had Connaught Laboratories. Do you all remember that?
Yes.
Connaught Laboratories, I came to Canada to work for Connaught Laboratories. I moved here to work for that company. And it was the second largest vaccine supplier in the world. And those were our policies. We allowed it to be bought. We allowed it to leave Canada. So we haven't been strategic in some of these areas where other countries have said, look, this is vitally important to the country. It's a matter of national security as well as economic development, and we will not allow these things to leave. Can you imagine if that had been here and we built on it? Now, having said that, the Sanofi Pasteur, which is the old Connaught, still has its headquarters in Toronto, and we still have the jobs there, and we still have some economic development. But that's not the case in all the other sectors we lost. We lost in the insulin business. We had the Novo business, which we sold to Nordisk. And I can go on and on and on, but I won't. But, and so we have to kind of think, what do we want to do? Just build and let things move? Or do we want to build and keep these ecosystems here and keep these clusters here and have multiple jobs and pipeline for the great talent that comes out of our institutions? This is a fundamental cultural shift, Paul.
Let me turn to your colleagues to continue this conversation that you've kicked off. Perhaps to rephrase the question, Alan Bernstein, I'll go to you first. It's been annoying to me that for the last 6 months, the question has been, how can we get vaccines? Whereas for the longest time in the area of smartphones, the question everyone asked was, holy cow, how did Canada invent smartphones via BlackBerry? In e-commerce, the question is, who can catch up to Shopify, which is a Canadian firm? And so the question, it seems to me, could be, how did Canada get so far out ahead in pharmaceuticals capability? And that sure hasn't been the question in the last 6 years. Now, when I phrase the question that way, is that just vanity? Does Canada actually need a homegrown capability? And if so, is it reasonable to expect that it could produce that capability over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
So, a great question. So, and this is a great topic, close to near and dear to my heart, of course. Look, we need to complete the swing. So if we're going to invest, as Karima just went through, heavily into academic research, which is the watering hole, which is the sort of I'll use a different metaphor, Karima. It is the oil in the ground.
Yeah.
No point building a pipeline with no oil. And the oil in the ground is the knowledge and the technology and the people that you need to do great science. So I always start with, what do Canadians care about, actually? So these days, I think if you ask most Canadians, other than getting rid of this virus, they would say they care about their health, and they care these days also about climate change and renewable energy. These are two areas where not only is it fantastic opportunities to create jobs, high-paying jobs, as Karima already told us, but these are areas that start with science. And so what is our ambition as a nation for the country? Is it to continue simply to be, and this is not a negative comment on natural resources, but it's a monoculture, if you will. Are we simply going to be an extractor of our forests and mines and wheat and oil, or are we going to go into the new knowledge-based industries? And if we're going to go into them, we need to go into them, I would argue, in areas where matters to Canadians. And I think the areas, as I said, to me, are pretty clear. They're health and renewable energy at the moment. And it's also about good jobs for their children. And we all know, I think it's obvious, I think, we don't need an economic study. The good jobs for the next generation of Canadians is going to be in these knowledge-based industries. It's going to be in healthcare. It's going to be in startup biotech companies. And Canada actually is doing really well over the last 2 years. There's been a lot of great startups in the biotech space and life sciences space, which is unusual. We've been doing phenomenally well in artificial intelligence startups, which I feel really good about because AI started at my organization at CIFAR. A little plug there. And we are doing phenomenally well, actually, in terms of thinking about how we can be innovative. Now we need to act. And again, we all would agree, it's not about picking winners and losers in terms of which companies, but I think it is about choosing, why do we want to innovate? What areas are important to us that matter? Is it to deliver our groceries just by doing, getting on the web and ordering some groceries from the grocery store? Or is it improving our health and dealing with climate change and other things like that? And that's where I think Canada, because of our strong base of fundamental science and growing base of venture capital, can actually make a big difference.
Goldie had the same question, because I suspect it's also quite near and dear to your heart. Is there any point, we've shown that we can buy vaccines in massive quantity relatively briskly. Is there any point, given that, in encouraging the development of a larger homegrown pharmaceuticals capability?
Well, it certainly seems to me, from a national interest perspective, yes, and our governments think so, and I think Canadians would think so. The question we have to ask ourselves, we had it, and then we lost it. So we better figure out why, because those of us who were working on those files back then said, be careful what you do here, because the following actions that you're going to take are going to have this ripple down effect. I'm not threatening you. I'm just telling you how global capital works. And if you're inside a company and says, look, you can go to a country and instead of receiving a red carpet, you'll receive red tape. Guess what? Capital doesn't form there. It goes somewhere else to form, and that's what's happened. It gets harder to get it back. Just because we want it back doesn't mean it's going to reemerge here tomorrow. You have to work for it. You have to fight for it. The mobility of capital is so very, very real. And so the message I would say is policy matters. The right regulations, the right policies matter. Now, Alan has made a great case here for the importance, and Karima has as well, about the importance of academic research and so forth. I would say that's the watering hole again, right? The step two is, how do we take those incubator programs? How do we take those companies of scale and get them to the level of scale that they can be the BlackBerries and the Shopifys? Because for every one of those two, Paul, we probably lose 100 of the other ones. They're too small, they disappear, or they get purchased. I mean, I just lost a next-gen member called Element AI. Everybody thought this is where they were going to make it. You talk to them and they go, we just didn't see the runway here. We just didn't see the support. We didn't see the path, but we saw it down in Silicon Valley, right? I talked to my members about keeping talent in Canada, and they go, well, in Canada, you're the richest of the rich at 200,000 Canadian. In America, it kicks off at 400,000 US. So somebody who wants to aspire to do well, they find a way to get south. So we have to wake up and realize that as great of a country as this is, we have to compete. We have to compete for the talent, and we have to compete, for the people. So the concern I have is, you've listened to the great work that Karima and her team did at the Industry Strategy Council. And Paul, you as a top-notch journalist in Ottawa, I would hope that you're conscious about what I'm about to say now. But think about it. This report was commissioned by the government. It was designed to give guidance to the government on building two things. First, a reopening plan, a response to the pandemic. How are we going to get some normalcy back in our lives? And secondly, how are we going to compete and grow our economy so that it's not an anemic 2% growth? How are we going to make it 3 or 4% growth? That report is an excellent report. Now, it's all, there's a lot there, no question about it. But the government's response to that was two things. One, it was released on a Friday afternoon on the exact same day that they did the carbon tax announcement of $140, per ton. So what do you think made the news on Saturday and Sunday and every day since then? The carbon price announcement. So to me, it was a very deliberate act to put that report out on a Friday afternoon, because guess what the message is? We don't really worry about the economy too much around here, right? Money's free, money's cheap. We got lots of money, we're going to do it, which brings me to point number 2. Don't believe me? Here's the budget. Here's $100 billion for all kinds of things. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, and a little bit of this, and a little bit more of that. What Karima is saying is, we actually got to pick some lanes. The answer I think we as Canadians need to be, or the question we need to be asking ourselves is, what do we want to be when we grow up? What kind of a Canada are we leaving for our children and grandchildren for the next 150 years? Because as I just said earlier, it hasn't been too hard to be Canada for the last 150. You've been blessed with natural resources, tremendous demand for those resources, right? Then you built an economy around human resources because you were welcoming to immigrants. That alone, population growth alone helps your GDP, as we know, but it's insufficient for a long-term, deliberate, intentional strategy. We often talk about the DARPA model, the Kennedy era. I want to put, at that time, a man on the moon, and they did it, right? And so what do we want to do? And I think policy matters, regulations matter, attitude matters. If you're a country that says, I'm just going to settle for good enough, you're not going to attract those who want to be the best, those who want to excel, those who want to grow. So we have to change the way in which we present ourselves to the world, not just being nice, not just being reliable, but being hungry, being competitive, wanting to build the best. And that means a relationship between business and government and academia and labor and Indigenous and others to pull together some kind of a vision for the country that says, here's how we're going to put Canada on the trajectory for growth. And that, my friend, is what I think is lacking and why I get passionate about this issue, because it is very much a partnership. No business can do anything on its own. No government can do anything on its own. And the best example of that is the pandemic. Every time government ran into a problem, we don't make PPEs, call the business community. We're having trouble distributing vaccines, call the business community. We can't get rapid screens used by the provinces, call the business community. We need to start making vaccines for the next, the booster, call the business community. So if we're good enough to help you solve your problems, why can't we be good enough to sit at the table and help you chart a course forward for the economic growth of this country?
So the federal government hasn't done nothing nor close to nothing on this. The federal government provided a kind of a robust answer to all these concerns in the recent federal budget. I have in front of me page 72 of the 720-page federal budget. Chapter heading is Strengthening Canada's Biomanufacturing and Life Sciences Sector. It includes $2 billion over 7 years towards growing a vibrant domestic life sciences sector, $500 million over 4 years for the Canada Foundation for Innovation to support bioscience capital, and on and on and on. Karima, does that sound like the kind of response you were hoping for?
So that sounds enormous to Canadians because we had so little to start with in those areas. But let me just give you a reality check on that. Is when we look at the investment made in R&D and innovation, the RDI in the world, and you look at OECD countries, the average spend in the OECD countries is 2.47% of the GDP on R&D and I. Okay, in Canada, we spend 1.454%. So we're not even at the average. We're below. We're somewhere down by Slovakia or whoever. The top countries that are doing that spend, like Israel and China and UK and Germany, it's between 4 and 5%. So just think about our problem. Right now, just based on 2019 spend, we are $22 billion. We have a $22 billion gap in that area. That's just that part of it. Okay. And if you look at our budget, it's an enormous budget. It was, sort of biggest budget we've had in a heck of a time. But of the 10 top programs, 9 are in social services. There's only 1 that was for economic development. You have to break down those numbers and really look at where everything went. Now, granted, we were in a crisis. We have to take care of people, and there's going to be a lot going to social services. But we're talking about moving forward. Moving forward, we cannot have another budget like this, where you have a minuscule contribution to the economic development piece, and everything else goes to social services. If you don't grow the pie, if we don't grow the economy, how are we going to be able to give the social services that we all want to give as Canadians? This is who we are. That's one thing. The second thing I want to say is, to both Alan and Goldie's points around, it's changing the mindset and it's changing the culture. Government itself and people itself, we don't celebrate our innovations. We don't celebrate. Who knew about Acuitas and Peter Cullis's technology, Alan? You know, which
That's why I always talk about it, Kareem.
well, I'm so glad you did. And, you know, of course, I have to give a plug. Peter Cullis was my scientific director when I was the CEO at CBRD. And what a brilliant scientific director. And he's had so many innovations. So many companies have come out of his lab. But who ever talks about it in Canada? Who celebrates it? You know, I always joke, but it's really not funny, about it took 100 years for Canada to give poor Banting and Best a statue, you know, to give them a recognition, 100 years for insulin. This is Canada. So, you know, today's generation and today's youth, you know, as Goldie said, they want to go where, you know, they're welcomed and creativity is celebrated and innovation is celebrated. There is need for a shift, a cultural shift in mindset, top down, bottom up. It has to be
So,
you know, significant.
So I want to jump in there, Paul, just to pick up Karima's last point. I want to be a little optimistic here, looking forward. I think one of the big sea changes, which we should be sort of capitalizing on, are young Canadians. They are extremely entrepreneurial. They really want to take on the world with their ideas and move forward. And that's a sea change. You know, when I was their age, as it were, we weren't thinking about going into business as young scientists. The young scientists today are all thinking about going into business. You know, my offices are in Mars, the incubator buildings in Toronto. If on career days, there's always 2 career days for big companies and for startups, you cannot move in the atrium. There's all these young kids looking for jobs with companies. And so I think that energy and that intelligence and that entrepreneurial spirit is a new energy that we have to capture and take advantage of as a country. The other thing I would say is, and this is going to be an uphill battle now, the last 4 years, we had a lot going for us. Goldie talked about the 75 years and the 75 years. We also had 4 years of Donald Trump. That played to our advantage in big time, because a lot of bright people came to Canada as a result of that. That's changed. And so our ability to attract and retain talent, entrepreneurial talent, banking talent, scientific talent, all kinds of talent, is going to be tougher now. And so we have to work harder to do it. It's doable. We are a very attractive country to live in. But the push and pull of convincing people to move, that equation has changed quite a lot. And so we need to sort of work harder at making sure we attract the talent and get the ideas and the venture capital and the capital that Goldie's been talking about to actually start those businesses and really move forward. And that has to be a deliberate government policy that they are going to move forward with this, because that's the kind of country, that's the ambition we have as a nation, to keep our best and to do our best. Otherwise, we're going to revert back to where we were before, and I think that would be a huge mistake. I want to end with one little, go ahead, Goldie.
No, go ahead. I just wanted to add after you're done now. Go ahead.
Well, I want to end with a little story. So Karima mentioned Connaught Labs. So you'll recall that President Biden agreed to loan us about 1 million doses of AstraZeneca. So here's the story. During the heights of the polio epidemic, the Salk vaccine was the equivalent of the Pfizer vaccine of today. Every parent wanted their child vaccinated with the Salk vaccine. It was an inactivated vaccine. A lab in the company in the United States made a batch of that vaccine where the virus was not completely inactivated. And a lot of American kids got polio as a result. The Americans turned to Connaught Labs. They turned to Connaught Labs and said, we need some vaccines quickly. Will you give us some? Will you sell us some? And Connaught Labs said back in the 50s, not only will we give you some, we'll give you these vaccines. This is for children. We will loan you these vaccines. So Jonas Salk came up to Toronto to thank Connaught Labs for having this sort of flagship manufacturing facility for vaccines, and the capacity for making high doses of vaccines was called the Toronto method. Because a young female scientist at the Connaught Labs developed this methodology for for making vaccines, the high titer, the Salk vaccine at high titer. So we can be a leader. Indeed, we were a leader. So when President Biden said he was going to loan us some vaccines, I immediately thought, gee, we gave you the polio vaccine 2 generations ago, and you're going to loan us a vaccine that no one wants in the United States? Very generous. So, you know, we have certain values here as a nation that are translatable to the world, that the world really needs badly. We have the scientific talent, the entrepreneurial talent, the banking talent, the VC talent. We can do it. It needs a partnership across all sectors, including government. Sorry, Goldie, your turn.
No, don't be. That was a great story. No, I just wanted to add that one of the things that we're not talking about here that I think is relevant is our political leaders follow the public. So if the public isn't where we need them to be, you can't blame the politicians for not getting there. So all of us collectively have a responsible not to have an echo chamber talking to the convinced, but to do what we can to reach out to the public. And there, obviously the media has a very big role to play in this. So if you look at the vaccine example, you know, how much public communications took place that said, listen, we're going to bring in this pricing mechanism. Here's the potential consequences. You know, you're going to save $1 or $2 maybe on your prescription medicine, but down the road here, we may not have any vaccines if we ever need them, but that's okay. We'll buy them from somebody else. Was that debate discussed in the public society in any way, shape, or form? Now, I would say to you, the modern debate of that now is climate change. You know, on the issue of the climate, which is obviously, I think, as soon as the pandemic's over, we return to the fact that that is the greatest threat to mankind right now. What are we doing as a Canadian government, as Canadian businesses, but also as the Canadian public to educate the public about what these choices mean, what the costs could be? Because so far, we're living in a world in which people are starting to believe that I should not suffer in any way, shape, or form under any circumstance. So even in this pandemic, you know, which was a true crisis if there ever was one, obviously there was tragedy, some people died. But you know, for the vast majority of people, we made darn sure they never felt any pain at all. And it's part of the reason we're having labor shortage in the marketplace today. We can't find labor back because we're like, I'm good. I've been taken care of through this pandemic. I don't have to go back to work and stuff. We need to engage the public on this to have them in an educated debate about, okay, do you understand you're going to have to pay more for a lot of things as we make this transition? Do you understand that if we drive away the investment that's coming into our energy sector, it just doesn't mean anybody buys any less oil. It just means they don't buy yours. And that's not a good thing. That could be a bad thing. Do you understand what the GDP consequences are of losing that kind? We don't talk to the public intelligently, but I want to say this one thing. I have enormous confidence in the collective wisdom of Canadians. If they are treated with respect, if they are allowed to discuss and yes, disagree. They showed me in free trade and a variety of other places that they can find the right answer. So we need to do a better job of engaging the public to understand what we're talking about, because only then, and there's no politician I've met that tells me they hear about anything we've talked about at the door today. They don't hear about competitiveness. They don't hear about regulations. They don't hear about, you know, productivity. None of those issues show up at anybody's door. Right? How do we make this issue more in the public consciousness to understand that this is not about businesses getting richer or academics getting more money? This is about building a country that can compete for your children and their grandchildren. We're not having that discussion, but this moment gives us a chance to engage with the Canadian public because they're paying attention now.
So Paul, if I can just say that your industry, you know, there used to be a lot of science writers and a lot of people who talked about health and all of these things when I first came to Canada. You know, I'm hard pressed to find them. I mean, if you compare with the media, for example, in the UK, whether it's the Guardian or the Independent or whatever, the amount of education to the public through media, you know, it's phenomenal on health. And the bioscience sector. So that's number one. And number two is, you know, Sir John Bell came out here a few weeks ago and was in Vancouver, and we had some sessions together at the Life Sciences BC and so forth. And he was talking about, he said, you know, 20 years ago in the UK, we were where you guys are in Canada. We had this kind of siloed relationship, you know, where academia was, where government is, and where big industry is. He said, today we don't do anything without being together. It's all hand in glove. The way we move forward, you know, industry setting up innovation centers, you know, all over the place. It's not about government having to finance everything. as well. But it's government creating an enabling environment, a dialogue, and allowing, you know, industry to participate, and academia, and together having these strategies and policies moving forward. And I would like to see, you know, a industrial policy for this country that encompasses that and has dollars attached to it to say 10 years from now, this is the Canada we're going to look like.
Yep. We could have a whole other hour-long discussion about the role of the media and the media's ability to fulfill that role in the current environment. I'll just point out that when Dr. Bernstein and I met, Maclean's had 60 staff writers. Today it has 7. That in the middle of 2019, a year before the pandemic, the Globe and Mail bought out 79 of its editorial employees. It is not as easy to fulfill certain public functions while your entire industry is falling off a cliff. But that's a discussion for another day. Lightning round. You are Deputy Minister of Finance, and you're telling the Finance Minister what is needed for the next budget to ensure that we're in better shape for the next pandemic. What's the top recommendation on your list? Alan Bernstein.
Wow. Okay. Top recommendation. I think we have to set our sights high and get everybody in the room, academia, industry, government, in the same room, just where Karima ended off, and say, how are we going to develop the relationships and the processes so when war strikes, we're ready to act quickly. Normal processes do not work during wartime. We have to drop those. We have to develop those relationships, and we have to understand where the needs are and move quickly to make those things happen. And so there's a plan afoot amongst the scientific community to develop a vaccine, not in 300 days, that's way too slow, in 100 days. So how can Canada contribute in a meaningful way, not looking back to what we did in science 30 years ago, but going forward, how can we contribute to that global effort to develop a vaccine and drugs within 30 to 100 days? What's the role? How can government make that happen? And how much money do I need to put on the table as Deputy Minister of Finance? Okay. Working with industry, academia, and government.
Goldie Hyder, same question.
Partnership and plan. Let's work together. Point 1. Point 2, why don't we just dust off the Industry Strategy Council report, have a look at it, and figure out what bets we want to make. And it's not about choosing companies, it's about choosing sectors, and have a vision for this country. You know, I often get asked, what would you say to that? And my answer always is, imagine if we could say that Canada is going to be home to the world's smartest, most diverse, workforce in the world. Let's aspire to do that. We can.
Okay. And Karima, did you give us your answer in 2018 with that report, or would you have a new answer next time?
You know what? But we gave you the answer by each of those 6 sectors that were picked. And by the way, those economic strategic table sectors were picked out of the Prime Minister's growth strategy, which Dominic Barton led, and came out of that. So those 6 sectors were still relevant. And when we did the Industry Strategy Council report for the COVID, they became even more relevant. And the outcome was, we need to double down on this. So Goldie's absolutely right, is that we need to dust off. We added a little bit more to it, but the core was the same. And so, the only other thing I would add to what Alan and Goldie have said is that we need to integrate the 4 national policies: innovation, industry, trade, and skills. They need to be coordinated, and all these hundreds of programs that government has need to be aligned to drive the export strategy. Because as we said, Canada is too small to just be thinking of our own market. I would like to see that. I would be saying that. I would be saying, I want to see that 10-year industrial policy with the dollars that we can put behind it and what we're going to look like at the end of it. And having that joint economic health, partnership around that is really critical. And I would also emphasize that we need to look at the entire ecosystem in building these sectors and put the right metrics there to monitor them, along the way as we move forward. And I think if we actually did that, we would build resiliency and we would be ready for the next crisis or the next pandemic or whatever it is. None of us can guess what it is, but we have to be ready to mobilize and to get on it fast. So Goldie's point about the strong public-private partnerships and Alan's with academia as well as part of that, that's what's going to enable us. Those scaffolds need to be ready. We can't be scrambling at the time when we have a crisis.
Okay. On that note, and stipulating that we could keep talking for the next hour easily, I'm going to wrap it up because we have run out of time. I want to thank our extraordinary panel who came ready to play. I appreciate both the detail and the vigor of your answers to our various questions. I want to thank everyone at home for listening, and I want to remind everyone that simply because you gave an email address to register for this, you will be receiving an email which contains a recording of this session, so you can while away the hours listening to it again and again and soaking in all of the wisdom. And if you're interested in more events like this, and who would not be, you're going to have the opportunity to sign up for the Lawrence National Center mailing list. A link to sign up will be included in the follow-up email. So on behalf of everybody at the Lawrence National Center and the Ivey School at Western, I want to thank everyone and wish you all the best of luck as we move into what we all hope will be the last stage of this horrible mess. Have a good day.